So, as I previously mentioned, the war in Vietnam is going to forever mark and scar the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. And it really took its toll on his approval ratings, on American society culture, its relationship with the United States government, and its relationship with LBJ. So, ultimately, in 1968, when LBJ would normally be running for his second term, he decides he's not going to be seeking re-election, which doesn't really happen. You know, the incumbent always seeks re-election. So he is fully aware that he is pretty much on a mass scale hated by the American people at this moment. He gets on TV on March 31st and announces that he won't be seeking re-election. He does also announce that he's going to plan for negotiations to begin for peace with North Vietnam. And so after Nixon is elected in 1968, at the beginning of 1969, they do finally begin. So we'll talk more about Nixon's presidency next unit, but now we'll just talk about his involvement in Vietnam. So LBJ got us into Vietnam, and Nixon is going to be the one to get us out. So a month after formal negotiations began, in February of 1969, the Viet Cong launched another brutal and violent series of attacks on U.S. forces, and we once again started to receive very heavy losses. This is something very similar to the Tet Offensive. So this is crazy that we think that we're negotiating, then all of a sudden we start getting like huge waves of attacks again, and we're losing massive amounts of people. So Nixon had gotten some intel saying that there were some Viet Cong in Cambodia. So he orders a bombing campaign over Cambodia in secret to stop these communist advances. The problem here is that while he's ordering this bombing of Cambodia, he's going on TV and telling the American people that he's ending the war and that we're scaling back. And he's actually escalating the war and expanding it to an entirely new country. He announced that 25,000 troops would be removed by August, and that he was going to start the process of bringing all of our boys home. But it was clear that that wasn't really happening. So in November of 1970, once all of this comes to light, Congress repealed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, essentially stripping Nixon of the ability to just do whatever he wants, like bomb Cambodia. So in 1972, Nixon ordered one last bombing of the North Vietnamese capital and harbors, and then finally signed a ceasefire the next year. So that's when the United States ended their involvement in the Vietnam War. But that's not when South Vietnam ended. The Vietnam War went on until 1975, when South Vietnam finally surrendered to the communist North, and that was the end of the war. So the biggest way that the Vietnam War plays out in American culture is with the beginning of the student protest movement. So college campuses have always been a place of, thought and discussion and revolution, and we've seen that play out already in the civil rights movement. We talked about the sit-in movement and SNCC getting its start on college campuses, but the anti-war protest movement also gets its start on college campuses as well. College students from across the country lined up to protest constantly LBJ's continued involvement in Vietnam. They had been holding protests throughout the 60s, not just on the war, but protests for the civil rights movement, for women's liberation, and the environmental movement as well. In the 1960s, college enrollment was at 9 million, which was higher than it had ever been in American history. And there are a lot of reasons to protest when you were in college. People were upset because they didn't think the war really involved us. People were upset because they thought it was morally wrong. Some people were upset because they thought that the money could be used for better things. Other people just wanted to go because it was a social event. A lot of these protests turned into like total parties. I remember there was I saw an interview back from like 1969 or something, and there was a kid being interviewed about this protest, and he was like, I just came here to meet girls. And that wasn't uncommon. And a lot of people today believed then that all of this protest was a result of the post-World War II affluence and privilege. But the kids protesting here had grown up in an entirely different society where you necessarily didn't just fall in line and do whatever your government wanted you to do, that you spoke out and you reacted differently. So a lot of these protests that get really crazy begin with the University of California at Berkeley. Students started holding sit-ins and holding demonstrations protesting the war. Some of them even burned their draft cards, which was illegal. And students continued to hold protests. Some of them were even disruptive. Outside of burning their draft cards, they would, chant really sometimes offensive things like, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? That was really popular student chant, things like that. And it wasn't uncommon for some of these protests to eventually turn violent. We've talked about before, when you have a protest involving a large number of people, it's easy for something like that to turn into a chaotic situation. But the most famous event of all of this is the Kent State Massacre. So in 1970, on April 30th, is when Nixon announced the Cambodian assault. That's when he comes clean about, I've been bombing Cambodia secretly for over a year. So the next day, on May 1st, 500 students at Kent State, which is in Ohio. I know a lot of people think it's in Kentucky, but Kent is not short for Kentucky. Kent State in Ohio, they assemble at the center of campus in this grassy area. And they protested for a while, and then things disperse around 1 o'clock, and everybody heads to class, and they planned that they were going to protest again on May 4th. May 1st was a Friday, and they were like, we'll come back on Monday, and we'll just sort of pick up where we left off. They even buried, some of these kids can be really extra. They literally dug a hole in the ground and buried the Constitution because they said that Nixon had killed it. So a lot of petty stuff going on. That night, in the midst of all of this, high tensions, high emotions, and all of this happening, a fight broke out in town. Some beer bottles got thrown, windows were broken. When the police arrived, about 120 people had gathered, and a small fire had started in the street. The mayor, whose name was Leroy Sacrum, declared a state of emergency there in town. And finally, to get everyone home that night, the police had to use tear gas to get the crowd all the way back to campus. The next day, Saturday, the mayor, Sacrum, asked for the Ohio Army National Guard to come out. They arrived around 10 p.m. By the time they got there that night, a protest was already underway, and the protest had set the campus ROTC building on fire. The firemen showed up to put the fire out, and the protesters started throwing stuff at the firemen and trying to cut their fire hoses and stop this from happening. So once again, the National Guard has to use tear gas to get everyone back to where they need to go. The next day, Sunday, May 3rd, the governor of Ohio gets on TV, Governor Rhodes, and he calls the protesters un-American. That's a really big deal. And so there's another riot protest happens on Sunday, another rally, more tear gas is used again. Then D-Day, May 4th. Remember, I told you on Friday, they were like, we'll come back on Monday and protest again. Well, they didn't expect all this stuff to happen over the weekend. Monday arrives, and the protest is scheduled at noon. Now, the university, knowing all the stuff that had happened over the weekend, was like, no, we are going to cancel this protest. It's canceled. It's not happening. 2,000 people show up to protest anyway. Regardless of the cancel announcement, 2,000 people showed up. So the military starts trying to disperse the students, and so the students start throwing things at them, and one of them struck a campus patrolman. So the National Guard starts throwing out tear gas canisters to sort of push the kids back, but the students run up, grab the tear gas canisters, and throw them back at the National Guard. At this point, the National Guard then began to advance with their bayonets drawn. The students ran away from that area and reassembled at a different location on campus. And then at 12:24, Sergeant Myron Pryor began to fire at students with his .45. Several others began firing at them with rifles after he began. 29 National Guard soldiers in total admitted to firing a total of 67 rounds of ammunition. It all happened in about 13 seconds. Many of the National Guardsmen said that they were fearful of their lives, but this was sort of disputed because there was actually a lot of distance between the students and the soldiers. And then on top of that, the students were pretty much unarmed. Between, the closest soldier and the furthest away soldier, most of them were between 71 feet to 750 feet away from the students. All in all, 4 students were killed and 9 were wounded. This is actually college students being killed by United States military. It's an insane situation. The 4 that died were Jeffrey Miller, who you see in the bottom left. He was 20. He was shot through the mouth. Allison Krauss, top left. She was 19, fatally shot to the chest, died the next day. William Schroeder, top right, 19, fatal chest wound, died an hour after he was shot in surgery. And Sandra Schuer, who was 20, in the bottom right, she was shot through the neck. William Schroeder and Sandra Schuer were even part of the protest. They were literally shot while walking to class. One student, Dean Kaler, who was shot in the back, ended up being paralyzed for the rest of his life. So 8 of the National Guardsmen were indicted, but a judge dismissed the case because he said it was too weak. 58% of Americans in 1970 said that the students were responsible for the deaths. Only 11% said that it was the National Guard's fault. On May 8th, more problems continue. 11 people are bayoneted, which means, stabbed with the bayonet at the University of Mexico by the New Mexico National Guard. On May 15th, 2 students were wounded and 2 students were killed at Jackson State in Mississippi. You see them pictured here, Philip Gibbs and James Earl Green. 12 more were injured by the National Guardsmen of Mississippi. 10% of the colleges in the United States had violent protests during the war years here. So the legacy of all of this is that overall, the war is going to cost more than $150 billion, have a huge impact on our economy. Thousands of Americans are going to lose their lives. Others are going to be diagnosed with PTSD, and their lives will be forever changed. Overall, Americans are not quite able to unite behind this cause, but they do unite in the protest, which will finally bring it all to a close.